Hi everyone. So we're just letting a couple more people into the waiting room, in from the waiting room. So we'll get going in now a minute or two. Welcome all, and we're looking forward to kicking off. So good afternoon, everyone. We still have people coming in there, but we're going to kick off now. It's 2 o'clock. We've got a jam-packed agenda, so we're going to get started. So we are delighted to have you all here in attendance today for this virtual event, Housing First, a Collaborative Approach. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. My name is Mairead McGinn, and I'm the Director of Fundraising and Communications here at Depaul, and I'll be your host for today's event. Before we start, I'm just going to go through a bit of housekeeping. First off, this event is being recorded. Just so you are aware, you can see us, but we cannot see you, so please know that you won't feature in the recording itself. Please make sure your volume is up so you can hear all of our great speakers. For the best viewing, select the speaker view at the top right hand of your Zoom screen. We really hope that you enjoy the event we have put together for you today. I am delighted to be joined by a number of exciting speakers for this event, including Margaret-Ann Brünjes, Chief Executive of Homeless Network Scotland, Mary Hayes, the Director of Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, and Grainia Long, Chief Executive at Northern Ireland Housing Executive. We also have Depaul's CEO, David Carroll, and Depaul's Senior Service Manager in Northern Ireland, Deirdre Canavan, joining our panel. Our agenda for today's event should now be up on the screen for everyone to see. Our questions and answers section will be 20 minutes long, so we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And this will be done through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. The chat function will be enabled closer to that element of today's event. So, without further ado, I am delighted to welcome our first speaker, our very own CEO of Depaul, David Carroll, who will give us an insight into Depaul's perspective of Housing First. So thank you for joining us today, David, and I'll hand over to yourself.
Thanks very much, Mairead. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. And thank you all for joining us today. It's a real privilege to be here with three of the key leaders in the direction of housing and homelessness policy and services on this island and in Scotland. We are very happy that all of you have been able to join us for the seminar to reflect on the future of Housing First, particularly from a Northern Ireland perspective and the collaboration needed to deliver it effectively. Depaul are very proud of the role we've played in the furtherance of Housing First principles in Northern Ireland. And Deirdre Canavan, our Senior Services Manager, will outline some of our thoughts in our presentation. We believe that we're at a pivotal point in Northern Ireland in how we deal with homelessness and those with chronic homelessness problems. We have the COVID reset plan and the learnings that we've taken from the COVID experience in the delivery of homelessness services. Got the plans for the future of the housing executive, the future of the supporting people strategy, the importance of the draft homelessness strategy, the housing supply 15-year strategy, and possibly a new government later this year. Today is a great opportunity to pursue and champion initiatives on what can be done, specifically focusing on long-term housing and permanent housing solutions for those most marginalised and with the most complex and serious complexities, the prevention and speedy end to any episode of rough sleeping, and if possible, the avoidance or minimal use of temporary accommodation if you become homeless. Depaul's strategic plan, launched in 2021, shares the ambition of everybody here that homelessness can be ended. We signalled specifically 3 areas where we can play a major part. We feel we can continue our focus on those most marginalised through our low threshold work and harm reduction methods. We plan to continue to deliver innovative and specialised services, such as Housing First and alcohol managed accommodation services. And we wish to fully adopt a housing-led philosophy in all that we do. Being part of an international group and delivering services in the 2 jurisdictions on this island allows us to have a unique perspective on what works. And Housing First works. It works not only from an ethical or philosophical perspective, but also financially. The Centre for Social Justice in England recently published figures stating that for 1 year's investment in a Housing First tenancy costs £9,873, but that there are savings of £15,073. Our own study, conducted a number of years ago, using return on investment methods, showed that there are major savings to the public purse through the minimisation of the use of A&E, reducing time in prison, reducing hospitalisations for those engaged in Housing First, amongst other benefits. So where are we now? We now think that it's time to ramp up regionally and have an ambition that can match the efforts in jurisdictions such as Finland. The conditions are right for a bold leap forward. We commend our colleagues in the Housing Executive for the strong commitment to housing-led and Housing First approaches within the draft Homelessness Strategy. And thanks to the faith and support from the Housing Executive in supporting Depaul and its many partners with the delivery of Housing First up to this point. We feel it's time to get behind the Housing Executive to make a call to government to fully roll behind the Housing First programme and to make it a central part of the programme for government, to provide additional investment up and above the supporting people and current homelessness strategy investment to ensure its effective implementation. Why does this need to happen? All the evidence internationally shows that Housing First works best when collaboration, joint commissioning, and multi-agency delivery is at the heart. In order for the necessary resources to be devoted from different parts of government, it needs such recognition within the programme for government. For example, housing supply is key. Finland, the jurisdiction we all look to around Housing First, took a decision as far back as 2008 to plan their Housing First approach. We know that housing supply was key to their success, as well as commitment across central government departments and local government. The strategic commitment from Finland to the provision of single households housing has been key. A point has now been reached where only 53 emergency beds exist in Helsinki. Also, health requires fully to embrace the concept and recognise that core sustainable funding must be delivered to make Housing First work. Our learning from COVID shows incontrovertibly that we need health around the table to solve homelessness. Without health, we cannot fully address homelessness. Housing First has a key role in providing answers for prison release, avoiding homelessness, and preventing recidivism. Our own work in Northern Ireland has been very successful in this area of work, so the involvement of the prison service and probation service strategically is hugely important. The Housing First concept has a key role in providing long-term housing solutions for young people, particularly those vulnerable young people emerging from the care system. And in some jurisdictions, it's been used for refugees and asylum seekers with vulnerabilities. We ourselves assisted a woman who had been 8 years in direct provision in Galway with an autistic child to settle in Galway with wraparound supports, helping her child with disabilities and her own needs. So it can be extended to that particular group. How are other jurisdictions taking this forward? In England, 28 million has been devoted to 3 city region pilots in Liverpool, Greater Manchester, and the West Midlands. Margaret-Ann will speak about the Pathfinder approach in Scotland, and Mary Hayes will speak to the fact that in the Republic of Ireland, the new government has committed itself to an additional 1,300 units to be delivered in the coming years for Housing First. The Northern Ireland Housing Supply Strategy has to commit specific resources and plans to this service model. We all know the challenges of providing single social housing units from a cost effectiveness and community integration perspective. But now is the time to use the regional planning structures to commit to delivery of units that can be specifically used for Housing First properties. Also, our approach to allocations could be modified to allocate those assessed as Housing First candidates more easily to social housing tenancies. And our housing associations have an exciting role to bring their expertise and resources to the forefront as well. Deirdre will talk about Depaul's priorities and objectives, but as I said, we would like to see Housing First become part of the programme for government. We feel that a Housing First task force and director should be appointed in Northern Ireland. We feel that a specific core funding allocation from health is essential. And now we need to plan regionally of how many tenancies we require and the costs involved to deliver this from a capital and revenue perspective, and evaluate what is achievable in the short, medium, and long term. England has evaluated that it requires 26,000 tenancies. Depaul has never advocated that Housing First is for everyone who enters homelessness. It is only financially justifiable for those with complexities who require high intensive support. We have a golden opportunity as part of the Homelessness Strategy to set clear objectives about what we would like to aspire to and how each of us evaluate what part we have to play in delivering this. Thank you today again for your attendance, and we hope that today's event can play a small part in the furtherance of a full regional rollout of Housing First in the coming years. Thank you. So I'm going to hand back to Mairead. Thank you, Mairead.
Thanks, David. A really good way to, I suppose, start today's event with the context from ourselves as well. So thanks for that. So I'm delighted now to introduce our next speaker, and it's Deirdre Canavan, who is the Depaul Senior Service Manager in Northern Ireland. Deirdre is going to further expand on Housing First, giving us a greater understanding of the history of the service and the delivery model. And Deirdre will highlight a number of key statistics around the service. And we'll also be hearing from one of Depaul's Housing First service users, Patricia, in this segment. So Deirdre, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Mairead. I'll just put my slides up here. Can you see this okay?
if you just can't see the presentation yet, Deirdre.
Right. With me. Should be up now, yeah?
Yep.
Okay,
Perfect.
Okay,
Over to you, Deirdre.
thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you to everybody that's here today. So I'm going to take you through our experience and some of our thoughts in regard to Housing First. So just to start off with the history and how it all began. So the history of the Depaul Housing First model, supporting people back in 2013. We piloted the service in Belfast, and we focused mainly on service users who were using and living in our service called Stella Maris. And we believed that those individuals living there had the right and the potential to live more independently in the community. In 2014, we expanded the service in Belfast due to the demand, and the early indications were that it was working. In 2015, in partnership with the Housing Executive, a service review was undertaken, and the findings of that review were positive, and the service ended its pilot phase. Later the same year, we were able to expand into Londonderry, where there was an identified need for a Housing First model of service provision. Then in 2018, using the international standards for Housing First as a template, we conducted an evaluation of Depaul's Housing First service to the fidelity of the international standards and the 8 core principles. I'll speak later briefly about the findings of that report, but for anybody that's interested, the Fidelity report can be found on our website. Then in response to the Everyone In initiative by the Housing Executive during the pandemic, Housing First was further expanded in Belfast to target individuals with complex needs, many of whom were sleeping rough and had no fixed abode. So we considered several models when we were looking at a Depaul Housing First approach, and we looked at specialist housing with on-site support, specialist housing with visiting support, but considering the landscape and the homeless sector in Northern Ireland, we felt that a case management and case coordination approach was the most appropriate model. So you will see here that there are 8 core principles of Housing First: housing as a human right, choice and control for the service user, separation of housing and treatment, so it's not necessary for an individual to be in treatment in order to acquire housing, and recovery orientated. It's important to acknowledge that Housing First has a focus on recovery. Person-centred planning is really key, and flexible support as long as it's required. This is one of the key fundamental differences of the Housing First model as opposed to other services such as floating support and supported accommodation, which are often time limited. A Housing First service is there for as long as the individual requires it. So our case management model, I'm just going to take you through some of the steps of that. So we provide, firstly, the case management plan, and we assess and place and support the individuals into permanent accommodation. So when we receive a referral, the first thing we do is assign a key worker. They will engage with the individual, working at that individual's pace, and identify where they would like to live. And the key worker will then set about identifying suitable accommodation that meets the individual's needs. Every effort is made to try and find accommodation in areas of their choice. It's not always possible, but we do try. In partnership with the individual, a needs assessment is completed and a support plan developed. The focus is on their immediate needs, and often that's the basic things like shelter, safety, and food. The next stage is around the provision of relevant supports via referral agencies. Often referrals are not made for a number of weeks, and that's usually until there's a level of trust built up with the individual and that we're able to identify their needs and actually get their agreement and being willing to engage with other agencies. The time where referrals can be accepted by agencies can vary greatly, and this is usually due to capacity within the sector. The current pressures and demands within the sector can mean that it can take anything from 3 weeks to 3 months before another service can come on board. And this means that often the Housing First staff have to lengthen the intense period of support for considerably longer than we would anticipate should be provided. The case management and case coordination and the interaction of partner agencies. Basically, it helps to ensure that the package of support is suitable for the individual's needs, that there are clear communication protocols in place between ourselves and other agencies. For example, if a Housing First service user became a person of concern and that we hadn't had contact with them for a number of days, there's a method by which information is escalated and an appropriate response can be taken to ensure the person's safety and well-being. Provision of crisis intervention and response is critical in this particular model. While individuals will go through periods of stability, they will also have periods of crisis, and we need to be flexible to respond to those crises at the time they occur. So that means that our service is not a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. It operates outside these hours at weekends and bank holidays. So looking then at, I mentioned previously, the Fidelity Assessment. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but it's enough to say that the Fidelity Assessment of the service was examined under 5 key areas: housing process and structure, how housing and services are related, service array, and team structure and HR. The report was published and can be found on the website, and there's a link at the end of the presentation to our website. You can see that the chart here that they scored very highly against the area of housing and service philosophy, but scored lowest around housing process and structure as well as service array. So the key findings were that the service operated to the high level of fidelity to the international recognised standards. However, the lack of housing supply had a considerable impact on the capacity of the Housing First services. There were 87 successful placements made in that 2-year period, which equated to 74% of service users worked with in that time. The Housing First team had developed strong working relationships with statutory and community-based services to support the work of wraparound services for service users in their tenancies. However, the lack of formal agreements for these services is restrictive. Integration of individuals within new communities was a prevalent feature that affected the fidelity of the service and the delivery model, and this remains the same today. So statistics since the launch of the service in 2013. So case numbers, as you can see, the total cases worked with during that period was 368. This is made up of 296 individuals. Some individuals would have left the service and rejoined multiple times, so demonstrates how many cases were, that they were worked with on a number of times. So we're going to focus on the individuals as opposed to the number of cases. And the 35 is only really a snapshot in time of the case numbers carried at a given time. So during this time, it's important also to say that the service was being delivered by 4.5 frontline workers and the managers. Each worker carried a caseload of 10, but the international standards would recognise that the client to staff ratio should really only be 7 to 8. So the service is now realigned to the international standards. This outlines the gender split that we work with. So of those 296 individuals, 224 were male and 72 were female. There were no individuals who identified as other or non-binary at that time. As you can see, there's a significantly more males than females in the service, and the gender split would be reflective of single homeless population in Northern Ireland. We are seeing, however, a year-on-year increase of women referred to Housing First, and Depaul are now targeting women leaving prison, as this is an area of recognised need where Housing First can play a key role in the prevention of homelessness for women who are coming out of prison. You'll see from the data the highest percentage of service users were aged between 31 and 40, but this is closely followed by those in the age bracket of 21 to 40, or sorry, 21 to 30. So it's fair to say that really the primary age group is actually between 21 and 40. And if we take into consideration premature aging and those experiencing prolonged homelessness and the risk of increased health-related issues that are prevalent among this population, it is therefore critical that homelessness is prevented, or the length of time people experience homelessness is dramatically reduced. Housing First as a model is part of the answer to this. In 2018, we published a report on premature aging among the homeless population, and a copy of that can be found on our website. So support activities. The service takes a holistic approach to service provision, and based on the assessment of need, you will see that there's a volume and breadth of support activities that are required to be provided. The top of these support activities is managing tenancy and accommodation, with over 16,185 interventions, followed closely by general support and physical health and alcohol use. All areas of support listed are necessary at various times during the individual's journey to help them live independently and sustain tenancies within the community. So this is a breakdown of accommodation by type. So you'll see the figures reflect that individual Housing First service users deemed settled in long-term accommodation with the accommodation type itself. You can see that the broad range of housing options that are required, and the data does not reflect the number of times that we had to use temporary accommodation as a last resort due to the unavailability of independent housing. The majority of the individuals were placed into housing executive accommodation, closely followed by housing associations. And the 47 that you see in rented accommodation also include single lets. So all in all, Housing First placed 88.5% of individuals into accommodation. So the time in the accommodation, this data set is in a sense incomplete, as we currently don't have the means to report on those service users who no longer access Housing First, but may have sustained a tenancy. You'll see the 202 individuals sustained tenancies for up to a year, 57 up to 1 to 2 years, 16 up to 2 to 3 years, and 9 3 years plus. But further work is required to determine if individuals remain settled in their tenancy after their cases were closed. And some cases were closed in the first year, and that may have been because the individual felt they no longer required the service. So during the period, we closed 333 cases. The reason for service users ending their engagement with Housing First is wide and varied. They may have disengaged, their support needs may have been met, they may have felt they no longer required the service, or that longer term support accommodation was maybe more appropriate. Sadly, in this period, 32 people died. The list of agencies is representative of many of those that we work in partnership with in order to provide wraparound supports that are required. And it's impossible to include everyone, so apologies if any service is not listed. But you can see the support services span across a wide array of agencies, including statutory and voluntary sector, food banks, GPs, etc., and is reflective of the need for a multi-agency approach in delivering Housing First. I'd like now to introduce you to a remarkable lady who'll tell you about her journey in homelessness and experience of Housing First.
My name's Patricia. I had been homeless for 6 years. You know, I'm a service user with Housing First. I slept in the streets with a sleeping bag basically for a number of years, and then got into a vet hostel, and was able to drink in there, which for me at the time was great. And they did get me involved with Housing First. Being drunk, I don't really remember how. Don't really think I was that bothered either, because when you hear the word Housing First, you think it's to do with a house. But by being there, by getting involved with them, I didn't realise the amount of support that goes with it. and nobody tells you that until you actually experience it for yourself. So I'm just speaking from my own experience. They got me involved with things that I needed and didn't even know I needed, the likes of an occupational therapist, the likes of physio, phoning doctors for me, get me in contact with the doctor. You know, the doctors wouldn't even give me the time of day, you know, because I was drinking, but getting a key worker to do it for me was the listen. People that actually listened, you know. I had been I've been on the housing list. Housing First did get me a couple of accommodations until we found one that was suitable for me. We kept, the first two weren't suitable because of my disabilities. Got me involved with the disability and social worker, you know, that gets me involved with courses, things like that. You know, the main, it started with my own key worker would take me out for coffee once a week. It got me out of the house. You know, it was something that I needed, which worked for me, which has been great. I'm sitting here today. I have a roof over my head, which I'm very, very happy with. I have a loving husband, whom if it wasn't for Housing First, I wouldn't be married. I don't know how they done it, how they managed it. They knew I was getting married, so I had no family around me. So they planned it, got me a car, baked me a cake, done, come out at 7 o'clock in the morning to do my makeup and my hair. Fantastic. You know, what I realise now, and I didn't when I first started working for Housing First, was the amount of support. I think when I was drunk, I took it for granted that, you know, because I always walked into them and I always felt welcome. I felt at home there. I still do today, which is probably why I'm still with them. But I didn't realise until I got sober that the amount of things that they done, I needed their support more when I was sober, and for them to be there for me. And they're still here with me today. So they are, and life's great. Life's great.
All right. So I think you'll agree that Patricia is an amazing and remarkable woman, and she's an inspiration to us all. I have a number of testimonials that I just wanted to share with you as well. So basically, the first is around the journey of Paul. And Paul was released from prison. He had major mobility issues, and Housing First, whilst they secured Paul a flat, it wasn't immediately fit for his needs. So we worked with occupational therapists to ensure that the accommodation was made fit for Paul's needs. In the early days, there were some issues as well around neighbours and maybe noise. So the staff were able to intervene on behalf of Paul and negotiate with the neighbours and the housing executive, and Paul was able to sustain his tenancy. And in his own words, he said, "I don't know where I would be and what I would do without Housing First."
Sorry, Deirdre, could you just swap the view there in the display settings, please?
Sorry. Sorry, it's not really allowing me to do that. The joys of being live. No, it's not allowing me to do that, I'm afraid. Let's see. How's that?
That's perfect.
There you go. I am definitely not a technical whiz, so I'm amazed that I was able to do that actually. So then looking at the other two testimonials, both these testimonials are for individuals who had major health issues. The first tried to stop drinking cold turkey, which wasn't really advisable, and that resulted in them suffering from multiple seizures and hospitalisation. Housing First staff worked with them around their harm reduction methods and slowly reduced their alcohol intake. As they said themselves, I tried to stop drinking, and Housing First staff helped me, and it was more about helping them manage that in a more safe manner. The second is a service user who had very poor health and was supported to engage with the GP to stabilise their medication and get involved with the community nurse so that their medical needs were being monitored on a regular basis and addressed. In their words, I feel better now. I can manage to move around my flat. The Housing First staff are kind and tolerant and have good hearts. And I know that they go above and beyond. So in conclusion, we feel that much progress has been made, and we want to thank the Housing Executive and the Department for Communities for the support that we have received to date. It's fantastic to see as part of the strategies listed, and in particular the new Housing Executive Strategy, which is in its final consultation stage, the recognition and appreciation for housing-led and Housing First as part of a continuum of services in tackling homelessness. The delivery of the new housing strategy is reliant on a number of other strategies, so much is outside of its control. We would like to see cross-departmental commitment written into legislation so a housing-led and Housing First approach can be realised. The commitment to seeking ways in which to move people directly into housing and provide the appropriate support services to help them remain independent and out of homelessness is encouraging to see within these strategies and action plans. The collection of data and the synergy between health, housing and the voluntary sector. While there was very positive movements in this area, particularly during the pandemic, there is a need to further build upon this. More pace in the development of data sharing agreements between the statutory and voluntary sectors with appropriate pathways to accessing statutory services for this population is important. The Providers Investment Fund enabled us as an organisation to upgrade our client management system, hence why we were able to collect the data more accurately. It also enabled us to provide additional supports for service users to ensure that they were able to sustain their tenancies. Out of necessity due to the impact of the pandemic, it brought about new ways of working, more collaboration and a swiftness in implementing change. We need to take that learning forward into the next stage. The Common Assessment Framework has enabled the centralisation of referrals into Housing First via the Housing Solutions team. There are more regular review meetings to ensure that referrals are suitable, prioritised and housing options are explored. And finally, the impact of sharing current and future services, shaping future and current services. We have been able to share experiences and knowledge, working collaboratively with partner organisations. Being part of the All Ireland Housing First platform and engaging with the European Hub on Housing First has not only expanded our knowledge, but ensures that we remain in line with the international Housing First standards. We're delighted to see the development of the Housing First for Youth now being developed by Simon Community. In Northern Ireland, as David said, we've learned much from the experiences of other countries in delivering Housing First, and we have yet much to learn. So changes are challenges and solutions. So further investment in Housing First as part of the solution to homelessness for a cohort of people with long-term homeless and chronic health issues is definitely required. There's a need for multidisciplinary housing and health teams with specialist functions to identify high-risk cases, signposting and enabling access to relevant services. But real tangible progress has been made by the introduction of the Complex Lives Initiative. Ensuring that we have the right and appropriate data sharing agreements in place for this group is going to be critical. There's a need for the development of methods in which social isolation and community integration is addressed for individuals under the Chronic Homelessness Strategy and Housing First cohort. And that is very much reflected in the Housing Executive's Homeless Strategy. And finally, we need to develop opportunities for peer involvement in future staffing models for Housing First services. Now it's not allowing me to move. You will not be surprised to hear that one of the biggest challenges that we faced in delivering Housing First has been the supply of housing. The new housing strategy needs to be cognizant of the pace of delivery of housing and the reliance on the availability of suitable scattered housing sites. The housing options for Housing First needs to be mindful of the importance of community integration. Our findings are that Housing First and Housing Led works. It reduces repeat homelessness, and we absolutely acknowledge, as David has already alluded to, that Housing First is not for everybody, but it is a critical part of the overall solution. Further investment into Housing First and community-based services such as intensive floating support will be necessary to current and future Housing First services. We cannot forget the role of the private rented sector and the need for sustainable rent deposit schemes. Rent setting aligned to housing benefit is also critical. Local authorities and housing agencies all have key roles to play in providing the appropriate housing options. So we talked earlier about the evidence base and the need for a multi-departmental approach. So based on the evidence previously listed, it is clear from the number of interventions relating to offending behaviour, health and addiction, and the interdepartmental approach is critical for the successful delivery and sustainability of a Housing First model. So just to remind you of that, of the evidence base, when we looked at the interventions provided by Housing First staff, you can see that under criminal justice, 12,298 interventions were made, closely followed by 11,549 interventions under health needs. And I think there's a strong message here that ending homelessness and delivering Housing First services cannot be the sole responsibility of one department. So what now? We feel that it's important that there is an interdepartmental oversight and direction with high-level departmental commitment and strategy. The housing supply strategy for Housing First and affordability and security of tenure is critical. The introduction of a task force for Housing First, led by a Northern Ireland Housing First director, would be helpful to bring this forward. It's also important to define what a Housing First model looks like in a Northern Ireland context. I've given you an overview of what our model has looked like and what our experience is and what our learning and challenges have been. But we need to define what an overall Housing First model looks like for Northern Ireland. A feasibility study on a comprehensive rollout of Housing First would be very beneficial. So hopefully that has given you some insight of our experience. And thank you for listening, and back to yourself, Maria.
Thanks, Deirdre. Got really comprehensive presentation there. I definitely took a couple of things away myself there. I think the number of agencies involved is really interesting. And also just the split between criminal justice and health, that statistic is really interesting. And to be honest, the general stats that you've been able to pull together as well, Deirdre, it's really, really, really interesting. And I'm sure many people here will feel the same as well. So I'm sure we'll have a good few questions coming from your presentation after this. And also just to say, like Patricia's testimonial there and her video, absolutely incredible woman, and we're just so delighted that we were able to support her, including, I know some of the team made a wedding cake for her as well. So skills that in that area as well as everything else. So look, without further ado, I'm going to move on to our first guest speaker now. So we have Margaret Ann Vernaez is the Chief Executive of Homeless Network Scotland. Margaret-Ann is going to deliver a reflective piece centred on Housing First in the context of Scotland, the delivery of Housing First in a community, and how to ensure fidelity. So thanks a million for joining us, Margaret-Ann. It's really lovely to have you here, and I'll hand over to yourself.
Thank you, Marie, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me along to this session this afternoon. It's just so good and so important, I think, to learn from what's happening here in Northern Ireland, the phenomenal progress that's been made and also hopefully just to offer a few insights from Scotland and the kind of path that we've been on and where we are heading next. What I'm going to do is try and share my screen and hopefully do that without too much fuss. And if you don't mind, Mairead, I'll maybe just checking with you that it's sharing before I get going. Okay.
Yeah, so we can see it. Yeah, perfect.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I think what I would like to then spend the next 10 minutes or so doing, if I can, is just set out a little bit on the change programme and the culture as well as the policy change that's really created the right conditions for Housing First in Scotland. Then kind of bring you right up to date in terms of Housing First and how it's operating currently. And then what I really want to do is spend most of the time, as I've been invited to focus on the Housing First infrastructure. So what it is that we've put in place in Scotland to enable all those partners that are needed to scale up Housing First to support them to do that. And that infrastructure is across these 4 aspects here on your screen. So it's about how we create opportunities to connect, to share learning, to check up, which is our Fidelity test, and also the academy provided by our colleagues in Turning Point Scotland, which is the opportunity to learn and to train frontline staff. So if I could just start maybe just with a little bit of a sample in terms of the journey that we've been on in terms of the culture change in Scotland. It really resonates when I was listening to Deirdre earlier in terms of some of the changes, some of the challenges, what you need in place, the multidisciplinary approach, and it really does resonate very strongly with our own circumstances too. And I think around that, some of the wider change around how homelessness is understood and how it's responded to in Scotland. So if traditionally how we've understood homelessness is something that starts in a community, that if we understand poverty as a key driver of it, that instead what had been done was, instead of rapidly supporting people to remain within their community with access to the supports and the social networks they need to avert homelessness or to quickly resolve it, it's that over time in Scotland, and I think across other parts would recognise this as their system too, we kind of built this system around people, didn't we? Sometimes with different types of housing options than other members of the general public. And in a sense, with many over the decades, layers of good intention until we arrived at a system that's incredibly difficult for people to navigate and very expensive for local authorities and others to sustain. And if we come from this from the understanding, of course, that it costs more to actually keep people homeless than it does to resolve it. And not even taking into account, of course, the damage that homelessness causes people themselves. So I guess that change programme that was kind of instigated maybe over the last 5 to 10 years, but with real kind of effort over the last 5, is one that recognises that we know that there are some groups of people who are just more at risk of homelessness. And actually in the Scottish context, we know which communities they are too. You can almost predict homelessness by a postcode in terms of what drives it. And what those communities need is really healthy housing and labour markets and local services that can really prevent homelessness earlier and much closer to home before we bring people into this kind of homelessness system. So all those kind of associations around about community connections and relationships, all that provides the strongest protecting factor from homelessness in the first place. So if we understand what drives homelessness and the type of system that we actually need to respond to it, with that comes the acknowledgement that most of us, with the right support, can build and live our lives in an ordinary home as part of an ordinary community. So I think that kind of understanding, arriving at that place, just created the right conditions, I think, for us to start putting the right policy in place to enable us to start reaching that aspiration. So instead of the kind of traditional homelessness system, one which, people shared accommodation in congregate settings and lots of hostels in the big cities in Scotland, that over time and still now, what we're working toward is an aspiration where the types of housing options are relatively in proportion to what's in this kind of graph in front of you. So in Scotland, around half of households that ask for help from the local authority with homelessness, half of those households have no support other than their need for housing. So if we can put that to the side, which is what they need is a quick, rapid rehousing response. From the half that do, we predict proportionately that the majority of those will need a kind of relatively light to medium touch support role from the kind of mainstream housing floating support services. The Scottish context means that people have a right to access housing support, so there's a prevalence of floating housing support in Scotland to ensure those rights are met. And then, as you can see, the type of proportion that we think are best fit for Housing First, with a much smaller proportion relevant to a separate piece of research that's very current in our context, which sets out the likely role of supported housing as a settled housing option for a small number of people that want that support on site. So that's the type of scope that we're working toward. Where are we today? 27 out of our 32 councils have committed to start up or scale up Housing First through 22 to 23, so over this next year. And by committed, I don't just mean a kind of verbal commitment. Most are already in motion. A few are just getting going. So those are the ones that that really are kind of committed to making this happen. How did we get here? Scotland's kind of history of Housing First goes right back to 2010 when our colleagues Turning Point Scotland brought the first pilot to Glasgow in partnership with local housing providers. I believe maybe up to debate, but I believe it was the first in the UK. That remained a successful but relatively small project, and increasingly I think what a number of us were looking to do was how can we lobby to increase the scale of Housing First and ensure that it's sustained and funded. What happened was a cross-party inquiry in homelessness was recognising that particularly for people experiencing multiple forms of exclusion, that while homelessness in general in Scotland was going down, there was almost a kind of bolstering of that multiple exclusion homelessness. So we weren't getting better at responding to multiple exclusion homelessness, even though at that time the overall numbers of homelessness, of people experiencing homelessness was reducing. So it was a recognition that we needed to do something different from that group. So that's where the cross-party inquiry came and where the cornerstone recommendation for Housing First came. Just following that, the SNP government appointed a kind of expert group to make further recommendations round about homelessness, of which rapid rehousing, including Housing First, was a key recommendation. Around about the same time, a Housing First Pathfinder was catalysed, and it happened quickly thanks to the kind of very nimble approach that social entrepreneurs can take, and particularly one in Scotland called Social Bite, who not only worked with local partners to catalyse a Pathfinder across 6 different areas, but they also committed up to 3 million into the programme itself. With that commitment, that then enabled Scottish Government to come in and match and increase actually the funding to enable a single Pathfinder to emerge rather than having different pockets across the country. So the Housing First Pathfinder itself, I think it's quite useful just to offer a couple of insights on. It's a 3-year Pathfinder up to March this year in 32 local authority areas. That's 5 of the key cities in Scotland, including Glasgow and Edinburgh, and Aberdeenshire also, which enabled a kind of rural comparison to be done. What we are predicting is around 600 tenancies will be created with a very high tenancy sustainment rate that is aligned with kind of international practice. What we are finding, as Deirdre described in Northern Ireland as well, is that Housing First does work. So the kind of evidence that was provided in other areas is also ringing true now in Scotland based on this 3-year Pathfinder. It has so far had an interim evaluation by Heriot-Watt University, which concluded it was highly effective at the tenancy sustainment measure. with further evaluations, a kind of final evaluation to follow later this year into early next year, to hopefully give us more information around about cost benefit and other outcomes. So the cost of this Pathfinder was around 8 million. The first couple of years were jointly funded by Scottish Government, Social Bite, and year 3, which was to enable this transition, was jointly funded by Scottish Government and the 6 local authorities themselves. So that was a half and half, with a view to bring into the following year. Local authorities will pick up the full cost and continue to scale up Housing First. That's of course done with additional funding from Scottish Government through a funding pot that was enabled to enable local authorities to implement the rapid rehousing transition plans, which was one of the other recommendations from that action group mentioned. So this Pathfinder has been managed by the Cora Foundation, and my organisation, Homeless Network Scotland, provided a kind of project management and support role for that. So here we go. I'm just going to quickly take my time, so I'm not 46. Okay, so I am running a little bit over. Let me just then quickly draw out a couple of aspects that I wanted to share with you before I move into the video, which will describe it clearly anyway.
Margaret, you're okay.
Yeah.
We have some time as well, so you're okay. Keep going.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. I think it's just been 3 minutes. I'm always surprised when it passes that fast. Thank you. Okay, so the 2 quick aspects I wanted to pull out of the kind of 4 pillars that I described, will be described later in a short animation that I'm going to share. But I was especially asked to talk about the fidelity. I was very interested in what Deirdre was discussing in terms of the approach that's been used here, and it'll be great to swap some notes with that after. But first of all, what I wanted to share, in case it's useful for anybody to have a look at, is a national framework for Housing First that we developed. It's a 10-year framework. It's kind of co-published and endorsed by government, local government, key housing associations and others. And it basically, it's a 100-page document, but it's a kind of use of bits that you need, and it sets out exactly how to, and what the evidence and policy context is, a bit of a route map if you're starting up or setting up, and sets out some of the targets and the costings round about that. So it's on our website, and I'll give you the details later in case that's useful to anybody to have a look at. It felt important that we could have this common national framework so that we can really target Housing First where it's needed, so that we can cost it efficiently and consistently, and of course to deliver it effectively. Now, the second and final part of the kind of 4 pillars that I just wanted to draw your attention to is the checkup. So this is we call this the Housing First annual checkup, and this is how we kind of ensure that Housing First, when we're scaling up Housing First in Scotland, it's more than numbers, that when we're scaling it up properly, and it's really important that everybody has that assurance. So what we wanted to develop, which we have co-produced with local authorities and others and Scottish Government, is just a really simple, effective method that helps everyone, because it's in our interest that we do that for providers, for local authorities, housing and other. We all want the assurance that we're doing this properly. We wanted a kind of method that aligns with existing frameworks. And we also wanted to make sure, resonating very closely with what Deirdre was saying, that reaches into those broader frameworks, particularly around about health and social care and community and justice, that we really need to make Housing First everyone's business. So this Housing First checkup, what it aims to do as a function is support the quality of those that deliver Housing First support services. The majority of frontline provision in Housing First in Scotland is delivered by the third sector, so it's mostly charities. Some local authorities have started or are intending to bring it in-house as a local authority run service. So it's a bit of a combination. We want the annual checkup to support fidelity to the principles that underpin Housing First. That piece that's talked about a lot when we talk about Housing First, that it can be the catalyst for wider systems kind of improvement in local areas. And that really is starting to ring true in our experience as well. So we want this checkup process to be able to support some of that. And also that piece around clarity on when to step down and stand down Housing First, trying to find something that's locally sensitive but relatively consistent, so that Housing First is provided to the right people. This checkup process is in 4 parts, and very quickly it's about ensuring a 360 gathering of insights. So speaking to people in tenancies and Housing First tenancies, local charities, people working within the council, within housing providers and others, collecting all that insight and bringing it central within each local authority area. Then supporting a local authority lead and a few nominated key people from their area to reflect on the information that's been collated and to assess, to self-assess their own delivery of Housing First against a matrix that we've developed, which is based on the Housing First international principles. And then what we put in place, the first round of this is just currently happening now, is a sounding board. So literally a panel with a couple of independent experts on Housing First from outside Scotland to just provide a bit of coaching and support so that the whole thing is done within a kind of tone of support and improvement, rather than kind of trying to catch anybody out. And finally, we round that off with a report back into local authority area, who will then produce an annual statement on Housing First, which is put in their annual return to government. So it just means that there's that kind of whole approach of accountability and improvement. So if you want to check in with my organisation, listed there are the key people that support the Housing First and its Scottish Government team. It's led by Marion Gibbs, supported by Kevin Wilkie, and their details are there as well. Check out our website if you're interested in the framework or anything else I've talked about. And I'm just going to end, if I can, in just a short animation, which hopefully captures all of that in about 3 minutes. Thanks so much for your time.
In Scotland, we are putting housing first. Housing first is a national priority so that all of us can build and live our lives in an ordinary home as part of an ordinary community. Housing first means safety. It means choice and peace of mind. The best base for positive mental health to reduce harm and to recover from addictions and trauma. The Scottish Government has committed to scale up Housing First, a national framework to branch out right across the country and all councils with a local plan to achieve it. Best evidence tells us that we need around 3,500 Housing First tenancies each year over 10 years. While the highest demand is in urban areas, all 32 of Scotland's councils have people in their area who could thrive with a Housing First approach. There are 4 pillars that will support Housing First to branch out across the country. This is provided by Homeless Network Scotland in partnership with the Scottish Government. Housing First Connect, to make sure we're working together across all boundaries to plan and deliver Housing First. Why? To connect, to swap notes and to understand each other's priorities and challenges. How? With a programme of conferences, events, seminars, networks and briefings, in person and online, and a monthly news bulletin to keep you right up to date. Housing First Know-how, to gather and share the best knowledge, evidence and expertise on Housing First. Why? So that we can target it accurately, cost it efficiently and deliver it effectively. How? Branching out is the national framework for Housing First, and where all know-how is collected and updated. Housing First Checkup, to help plan, cost and deliver Housing First according to the national framework. Learning, coaching, exploring, supporting, benchmarking, together. Why? Because Housing First works when it is delivered in the right way. How? We will collect data 4 times each year, and we will facilitate an annual checkup, getting alongside each local authority lead to gather insights from tenants and partners, reflect on progress, be a sounding board, an expert outside perspective in confidence, present a shared solutions report for next steps. Housing First Academy, to support partners at all levels with training delivered by experienced practitioners. Why? To support knowledgeable, confident and expert professionals who plan, commission and deliver great Housing First. How? by delivering training directly to practitioners and managers, online and in person. The Academy is led by Turning Point Scotland, and now in partnership with Homeless Network Scotland, the learning opportunities are being extended. Housing First Connect, Know-How, Checkup and Academy. This is Housing First Scotland and is for everyone who is helping Housing First become the first response for people going through tough times. Housing First is normal, it's fairer, it works, and we all benefit. Find out how we can help you at www.housingfirst.scot or contact us at housingfirst@homelessnetwork.scot or housingfirstscotland@gov.scot.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting presentation and video. We're so delighted to have had you here today. So thank you for taking the time to speak to us. And I know you're staying around for the discussion afterwards. I'm sure there's plenty of questions coming through. So I'm going to move on now to our second guest speaker of the day, and that is the Director of Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, Mary Hayes. Thanks, Mary, for joining us today. And you're going to speak on the delivery of Housing First with a focus on the context of Republic of Ireland. So I'm going to hand over to yourself now, Mary.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks, Maggie, before me for a really interesting presentation, and Patricia and Deirdre before that again. I guess David asked me to participate today just to give some context, I suppose, in terms of what we're doing in Dublin and now nationally in Ireland. I'll just share my screen with you here to all going well. Is that working? Margaret, is that working? Sorry.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, if you just go to slideshow
yes,
and share.
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. But yeah,
I'd forgotten that. And I think just to start off, then we had we were talking about just to give you some context for Dublin in terms of numbers. The Dublin Region Homeless Executive is a shared service operation on behalf of the 4 Dublin local authorities. Numbers wise, in terms of homelessness, we have currently 800 at the end of November, the last published account that we had 815 families in emergency accommodation. That number has fluctuated over time, up and down, you know, again, depending, I suppose, on issues that are happening in relation to supply. We had, you know, quite a serious reduction in family homelessness during the COVID period. Unfortunately, that number is going up again. What hasn't changed, irrespective of COVID, irrespective of anything else, is single adult homelessness. We currently have 3,024 single adults homeless in Dublin. We've been talking, and Depaul will remember this, in Dublin we've been talking about our, I suppose we had a dissatisfaction with the traditional system approach to homelessness. Way back from, you know, the mid-2000s, we were asking ourselves about, you know, what was the value of transitional housing and the idea of funneling people through the staircase. You know, our own view, our own research at the time was showing us it wasn't working. So we phased out almost entirely. Now, there are some exceptional cohorts that may be transitional, particularly young people, etc., that transitional housing may benefit. But by and large, we phased out that part of the staircase. But as you can see, with 3,024 single adults, we still have quite a substantial amount of people living in sheltered or emergency accommodation. So we're not quite where we want to be, which is on the right-hand side of the Housing First, which is from homelessness to permanent housing in a much shorter time frame. Like the other areas, we targeted the most vulnerable homeless individuals, those experiencing chronic homelessness, rough sleepers, and obviously adopted, you know, treatment and recovery approach, but not as a precondition. To give a sense of the, you know, I suppose the scale is the main thing, and it's impressive to hear, you know, how much it's scaled up in other areas as well. At the beginning, when I went up to the north to start exploring Housing First way back, we were looking at targeting about 23 people in 2014. That was our kind of target group. And now it's ramped up quite significantly. Some of the important things around, I also run the allocation section for the local authority and Dublin City Council here. So I suppose it's very important to understand, to bed Housing First into all of your both nationally and local authority level, to bed it into all your systems. I guess, you know, without a supply line, you can see the breakdown of tenancies in the Dublin source of tenancies. We're heavily reliant on local authority owned stock or AHB approved housing body stock, obviously the nominations of which come through the local authority. The Housing First provider, that was the successful tenderer. They were expected to deliver quite, you know, a number of Housing First tenancies as part of the contract, and you can see that they account for 28%, local authorities 36%, other approved housing bodies 28%, and private rented 8%. So it is a lesson for us, I guess, that we shouldn't over rely on the private rented market to deliver for Housing First. It's, you know, it probably requires a different approach. The Icm model, very similar. Hate to break this to you, Deirdre, but we're 1 to 12 in our intensive case management ratio. You're probably right. You know, and certainly what I would say to you is, I guess, because the numbers involved in Dublin, I think currently we're at about 560. That's what we have. Some of the people we're working with now, you know, it's less intense. So, you know, their needs, they have been established, they've been in tenancy for a number of years. So the frequency of the visits has diminished as insofar as they need it or don't. There are cases, as you say, intensive periods of support that are needed, where for us, I guess, to salvage a tenancy, sometimes you may even get to the point where multiple visits are needed, kind of in a crisis point, or where things are very critical, or where there's a pushback in the community, you know, against perceived problems. Oftentimes that happens in the very early parts of a tenancy, when someone, I guess, you know, no more than any of us when we were in our, you know, started out in our first tenancies, wouldn't have been model or ideal tenants. And sometimes that's the same learning pathway for people exiting homelessness, and particularly long periods in homeless services where you've been living a very different life and a very different type of life. Very important for us, I guess, has been the real-time coverage, just that there's no waiting list for the treatment, no waiting list for mental health supports, that it's available to you on the spot when you need it. That's been probably critical to the success of the model here. And also that services are provided for as long as required. And from our experience, you know, there comes a natural point where some people will choose to close. You know, they want to know that Housing First is there, but they don't necessarily need, you know, they don't need it all the time, or that the supports definitely diminish over time. Where we are at this point in time, as I said to you, since the pilot point to here, we've gone from like talking about 23, targeting 23 people, to, you know, we've now 528 in Housing First at the end of December. It took 680 tenancies. So you will see that the investment that has to go in, like, you do lose, you will burn tenancies along the way. But of that, you know, less than 1% return to rough sleeping. And that's a really, really valuable statistic for us, is essentially, like, you know, it does, you know, it's what everybody's saying here today. Housing First works. We know it works. It's probably one of the most tested interventions, if you think about it in terms of housing. The sustainment rate in Dublin at the end of December this year was 87.7%. For us, and again, I'm talking about my specific council here, but in the Dublin region also, we've 3 target groups. We take rough sleepers, we're targeting rough sleepers who have been identified. Now, we particularly look at maybe a rough sleeper who was identified in one rough sleeper count. We do two kind of very intensive counts in a year, but also the Dublin Simon outreach team who are out and about. They know the people who are there consistently. They know who to target in terms of the chronic rough sleepers. So we also have the long-term homeless in terms of length of time that people are in EA. We also look at that. And then the last part, the more recent stream, has been the criminal justice stream. And that's where people with quite a long homeless history, but who are in and out of, who also have kind of an overlapping forensic history, and have been in and out without a stable tenancy, or without being, a chance to settle. So they have, we had a target of 20 last year. We didn't quite achieve it, but we were nearly there. I guess for me personally, I guess people I've known for years in homeless services, people, and, you know, they're housed now, they're gone. They're, people who say, and I remember, I'm old enough to be around, or long enough around, people we talked about who couldn't, it was said that they could never live independently. They could never have a life of their own. They would have to have care or shelter all of the time. And they didn't, and they survived in their own, it's great to see that level of independence. And if you think about all the other institutions in Ireland, we've moved towards, deinstitutionalizing everything. And that's a good and healthy thing for people's autonomy and their right of choice and their freedom of choice. And housing and homelessness is absolutely no different. Our target in Dublin City Council was 150 for we had our first our first implementation was 2018 to 21. We had a target of 150, we achieved 258. We just kept going because we could see that, like, in Dublin City Council, we obviously have the people who are from Dublin City, but we also have people who are here for long periods and who are really very much at risk in Dublin. So we've overshot, but from my point of view, it's still a small number in terms of when you think of like 3,000 that we have single adults homeless, it's still a relatively small number. So I feel it's, we were right to keep going in terms of the targets. 2021, again, in my specific local authority, the Dublin City Council, there was 101 people in Housing First across the region, but we had 13 rough sleepers straight from rough sleeping into tenancies, 27 moving from kind of in and out of chronic homelessness and or rough sleeping, and 12 from the criminal justice, and 9 of the tenancies, and you do have to factor that in, is that you do have to think about the rehousing, that has to be part of your tenancies, because not everything will work out perfectly the first time round, as you know. Scaling up, and I guess this is where we're at. We're all at this point of, we know it works. It's tried, it's trusted, it trusted and tried, and it's worked with maybe the cases that we were the most worried about, the most complex, the ones that we thought had the highest need. And now we need to think about, okay, so how do we move it on? In Ireland, what we've done is through Bob Jordan, who's now Bob used to work here as the director of Housing First. He's now moved on to be the CEO of the housing agency, but when in his work here with the HSE, they looked at we tried to identify around the country who are the people, or how many homeless people have very intensive health and complex needs. That number was 1,319, and I guess they're the people we'll be targeting over the next over the coming years of the new Housing First plan. For us in the Dublin region, the target is 707 additional tenancies to those that we have already. I guess what's important is, I suppose, less the numbers, but just the fact that it is now national policy. That's incredibly important. What worked for us, and what, I guess it's other people's experience as well, is that you really have to pull together. It's trying to understand the structures, because I don't know, here it's our health structures, our local authority structures, they're quite different. There's, the areas don't necessarily overlap, but we've had to pull together in a massive way. Now, COVID actually is a great help for that, because it helped us force together to work together. And now I guess we're going to do it for Housing First, is how do we really genuinely collaborate, in terms of homelessness, so that we're not, we don't have these mixed up systems, or, poor systems that are contributing towards homelessness. So we have a joint funding in the Dublin region. We have one tender for Housing First, and it's a joint funding approach between ourselves and the HSE. There has been, education and training, housing. There are a lot of supports have been developed, and they're all actually now, they've moved to the housing agency website. So Housing First manual developed to help people in terms of the implementation as well, and the rollout. The next plan is for 2022 to 2026. And there will be tendering processes in the major cities, Cork, Galway, Limerick, and a retendering in Dublin. And there has been quite a significant amount of consultation with international experts, and again on the scaling up and the building up of this, and that is fed into this strategy. It's in my view, it's a very good strategy, and I think we can go further. But I think it's an absolutely key milestone in terms of moving towards the provision of shelter, and moving away from the provision of shelter, to moving towards, as was so well put by the previous speaker, in terms of keeping people from where we know where they're coming from, and intervening at the point where it's meaningful and stop and prevents the homelessness. I guess some of the learning for this that went into the strategy, some of the feedback on the existing Housing First, is social integration measures need to be, sorry for the typos there, the social integration measures need to be strengthened, and again that's around the recovery and meaningful activity, and that moving from just being in your own home isn't enough. There is a need to create, I guess, some amount of something to replace that bond of, you know, lots of homeless people together in a shelter, you know, and the loneliness that maybe people were struggling with a little bit in the tenancies at the beginning. Greater service user involvement. I think that's a strong message. It's obviously come through from the other regions as well, that there needs to be more direct involvement. You know, there's great learning from that, and there's great trust, I think, from people who are, you know, in Housing First when they see, you know, service user involvement in the service. Staffing continuity came up as something to watch for, that it's important that there isn't a high turnover of staff, and one of the recommendations of the research behind this national implementation is that the relationship between clients and their key workers is very important, and that we need to look at maybe trying to create a better level of staffing continuity and looking at the reasons why maybe there was a high turnover. And so to move to a national footing, we're going, the decision was to take it away from necessarily just the Dublin region. We will appoint someone for a coordinator for the Dublin region, but the national office will become part of the housing agency, which is also a national office and supports local authorities and approved housing bodies around the country, and to build it up. For me, I guess the systems changes, right? I think there isn't, you know, stable housing. The first point here, stable housing is a platform for recovery, health and well-being. There isn't a day, I'd say, when someone hasn't said to me, still to this day, Housing First doesn't work. And you know, it doesn't matter how much you show the statistics or whatever, one bad experience and it's like, oh, you know, it doesn't work. And you say, well, look, it does, you know, and there's still, I still feel like we're championing it and really working with our housing managers in a local authority as the size of Dublin City Council. We've been, and you know, a number of regional local authority offices, you know, still pushing and showing people and building the trust that it does work. And to the point where you're saying to someone, well, look, you had 10 Housing First tenancies over there. They've forgotten about them because they're so stable now. But it still is this thing of pushing it and explaining to people, look, you know, homelessness is not a therapeutic intervention. It's not good for people. The only good place to meaningfully to provide supports is within a home. Creating new and tailored exit routes out of homelessness. The challenge of supply is obviously our biggest, you know, it's our biggest challenge in Dublin, particularly where we don't have, it's now we have a political will and we have, you know, I think a lot of consensus on our Dublin network that of where we want to go, and the difficulty being that to close down shelters, particularly the ones that are privately operated, we rely about 50% of our shelters are privately operated in Dublin, and to close them down and to move out of that, you know, the creation of exit routes for us is critical, and changing the practices that make and keep people homeless. My experience of Housing First, there's a few things. You need to underpin it. You need to look at all the bureaucratic reasons that work against Housing First. For us, I guess, as a local authority, we were planning we have a scheme of lettings priorities, which sets out, it's underpinned by legislation, and it sets out how, you know, all of the rules of your housing and, you know, who can get housed, who your priority is. And for us, we've built Housing First in Dublin City Council. We've built Housing First into that so that we can create chains of lettings. So when a tenancy breaks down, we can move people quickly or swiftly. And again, our bureaucratic processes wouldn't normally have allowed that. So, you know, you need to bring those with you. You need to change and adapt your systems to bring it with you, to make Housing First work and to make it dynamic. I guess as I said, the learning from the last one, service user involvement has been a huge one. The reconfiguration and reduction in emergency beds, where we're at in Dublin is we're about to go into a new phase of the Homeless Action Plan. And I guess, I think, you know, I mean, David will probably come in there. I think we're very committed in Dublin. All of the players are committed towards, you know, reducing homelessness, which sounds like stating the obvious. I think everybody really believes in Housing First or housing-led approaches. Housing-led for us just means a lighter touch than maybe the very heavy, you know, the heavy and intensive supports offered by Housing First. But it's the same principle of rapid rehousing, with maybe lighter supports or prevention where we can. So I think we're of a mind, and I think we just need to figure out obviously the missing supply piece, but we will hopefully get there. But it is great to see such tried and tested intervention that we now know works, and I think that's taken us a huge part of the distance, a part of the journey. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary. Some really, again, interesting points. I think it's really good to have the Dublin context. And I think the fact that it's part of national policy now as well is really important. I think that's why this conversation in general today is so important to have as well, and to look to see how others are doing it. So thank you for that, Mary. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to our final guest speaker of the day, and that's Chief Executive at the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, Grainia Long. So Grainia is speaking to us today on Housing First in Northern Ireland. So Grainia, we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming, and I'll hand over to yourself, and then we'll do questions and answers to everyone after that. So over to yourself, Grainia.
Thank you, Marie, and hopefully you can hear me okay. And I don't have slides today because I usually figure by the end of the panel that it's best to just not give further slides. But I mean, anything I say is available, and if I mention either research or statistics or anything else that people want to follow up, of course, just get in touch. Very, very happy to do so. I think what's been very, very helpful actually has been to listen and hear from other jurisdictions in terms of how the model has developed, and I think actually there's lots of similarities, but I think there are quite different I suppose systems changes. I think we're all at different points, and I think that I've certainly learned a huge amount, both from listening to Mary and to Maggie, and indeed from Mairead right at the start. In fact, listening to Mairead, I think Mairead, it's so obvious actually how far we've come in terms of Housing First in Northern Ireland, and I think we're in many ways now the planets are in alignment. I think for us to really see the model develop now at scale, and hopefully what I'm about to say and over the next few minutes, I suppose will give you a sense of the direction of travel in relation to that. But I think we really now understand both the potential of Housing First here in Northern Ireland, but also an increase in terms of how we value it and the impact it can have. But I thought I'd just start, because I don't make any assumptions that if you're from outside the jurisdiction, that you don't make any assumptions that people know a huge amount about the Housing Executive. I suppose just to kind of give a very brief introduction, we're the Strategic Housing Authority for Northern Ireland. So here, rather than local authorities holding the housing function, there's a single Strategic Housing Authority, that's us. So our strategic role means that we assess housing need, we undertake homelessness assessments, we provide advice and assistance and so on. So we undertake that function that sits in Scotland within local authorities and down south as well. We also provide the Supporting People budget, which again provides funding to our partner organisations, really important partner organisations, of about 72.8 million. So again, very, very large fund, and a very important fund to ensure that support that's required alongside housing is available. So on the strategic side, busy part of the organisation, very, very busy indeed. And last year, in the first half of last year, again, I suppose, Mary, very helpful to get the numbers from you. In the first half of last year, just the first 6 months, 8,600 households presented as homeless. A slightly different year. I know we've all, over the last 2 years of COVID, we've seen different fluctuations in terms of presentations and how they've manifested themselves. The big challenge for us has been the massive increase in temporary accommodation. We've seen roughly 190% increase in temporary accommodation. That has literally affected every part of the housing system here. I'm not going to talk at length about that, but I think much of what has been said, both by Maggie, by Mairead, and indeed by Mary, I think we all work to a very integrated housing system. That's the way it has to work. But when there's a bottleneck of that size in one part of the housing system, then it has a stress, and it stresses other parts. So you hear me talk a little bit more about that. So that's that in terms of the numbers. But the organisation, we're also a landlord at scale. So we are a landlord of 85,000 homes. And that's makes us the largest public sector landlord, certainly on these islands, if not further afield. But I think what's important, the reason I'm telling you that is it does give us a lever actually in terms of Housing First and making homes available and making allocations available. So I'll come on to that a little bit more shortly. In terms of the estates in which Housing Executive has a footprint, it probably relates more to about 220,000 homes. So some of those homes we may have owned in the future. So we really have an impact on about 1 in 3 households, a direct impact on 1 in 3 households in Northern Ireland. That just gives you a sense of scale. My own knowledge of Housing First, actually, Maggie, when you were speaking, it was really lovely to hear. And I worked in Shelter Scotland a long time ago in 2002, 2005, 6, and worked on some of the early pieces of very progressive homelessness legislation. But with hindsight, and Maggie's absolutely right, the legislation then recognise the importance of support and recognise the importance of support alongside housing, but with the best of intentions really didn't think through the model. I think in retrospect, we just thought if we said it, it would happen. and I'm not, I don't mean in any way to say that, I'm not speaking for Shelter Scotland when I say that, but I think that was the view was the legislative lever was the right approach. But actually years on, we needed to come back and really take a look at that model. And it's been really brilliant to see what's been happening in Scotland, and credit to everyone who's really grabbed that model and built it slowly and carefully over time. I think the other aspect for me that makes Housing First really valuable and compelling is the fact that it's rights-based. And so in other words, it puts the dignity of the human being at the centre of the work. And that's very, very attractive. And to all of us as housing professionals, that's critically why we go to work every day. It's about the person at the centre of this, but the dignity of that person who are in need and often for some in need for a very, very long time and have just never had some of those needs met and some of those rights realised. And look, I have it on my notes in front of me, and it works. So we've all said it. Everybody who've spoken today have shown and have said that it works, and I'm not at all surprised, Mary, to find that people would still challenge that on a regular basis. And in a way, that's why we have to continue to stress the importance of it, continue not to be complacent about investment, and continue to grow that investment. And the integration of partnerships, I think, is where this works. And from listening to you, Mary, that's where you've made it work, is by making people come to the table on this and helping them to see where the effect can be had. Just a few, I suppose, observations from me, and then I'll move into what we're doing here and more importantly, what we're about to do and what's to come on. It is, we very much take the view in the Housing Executive that it must be a housing-led and an integrated system. And again, as I said, where we see real fault lines. So, for example, a chronic shortage here of temporary accommodation, absolutely chronic, as bad as I've seen it in my career, has a knock-on effect elsewhere. And we are now placing people in accommodation that we don't want to be, where we don't want them to be there for the time that they are there, and so on. And there certainly is a sense here that the crisis that's upon us, we need much more time now to move beyond that post-COVID. The other aspect of Housing First that's really important, and I can't stress this enough, is the lack of conditionality. And again, listening to all of the other speakers today, that's what makes this really valuable. So we're not providing services on our terms as the Housing Authority. This is not a paternalistic approach. Lucky you to get a service, we'll give you what we think you need. It's not that. And that's really, really valuable. And I think personally that's why it works, because you build up trust over time with often either individuals or households who've never had a public agency sometimes saying, we want to build trust with you, and we're not going to do it on our terms, we're going to do it on the terms that work for you. And even if you don't know what they are yet, we're not going away. We will stick with it until we figured out what the issue is. And I certainly felt that very strongly in Scotland, that was kind of culturally the approach that was taken from very early on. And I suppose, speaking to that point about culture, I'm not under any illusion of the amount of culture and systems change that's needed here to make that work. So it is profound, but it is worth it, and it will be worth it as we work our way through. So I don't underestimate the amount of culture change that's needed and the amount of resource. And that's not necessarily cash, although I don't want to suggest that money isn't needed for this, but actually it's about the time and the effort that's needed to get this right. And again, listening to others, getting the method right, getting the framework right, it's important to do this and sense check it and keep trying until we get it right. I also really value what's really useful about Housing First in terms of what makes it work is the fact that support and housing are recognised as distinct, and they are each valuable in their own right. So they're not dependent on each other, and actually understanding them as distinct is really, really important. And looking where we've looked at practice from elsewhere, that's been very, very obvious. And therefore, when you understand how they're distinct and what makes them both valuable, then you can help them you can make them work together better. But I think one of the lines that really struck for me in the research that was done in the Liverpool study, in the Liverpool region study, which really rang true for me as I suppose as a housing professional, was when they talk about the importance. It's just as important that the rest of the system works well. So in other words, it's as pressing. So Housing First will have clear benefits for people experiencing homelessness, but what is equally as pressing is the wider housing-led system reform for the prevention of homelessness. And given the amount of emphasis that we are placing on prevention here in the Housing Executive in our homelessness strategy that we are just concluding, I think that's why I would say it bodes very, very well for the development of the Housing First model here in Northern Ireland, because I think over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, given the amount of investment we're about to put into prevention, and that bodes very, very well for this model, because we need both to work and work well. So just very briefly to talk a little bit about why I think the strategic context is really ripe and really right now for Housing First. Again, just to be, I suppose, really clear about what I mean by that. It goes beyond strategy and interaction. So it's not just about the strategies, but nevertheless, the strategies have to be there for you to get the action right. And those of you who've been watching this closely will know that the homelessness strategy, and many of you in this virtual room have fed in, and thank you for that. Thank you for your time and your effort and your energy for continuing to feed into that strategy. But what's critical in there, and if you're looking into the strategy for that assurance as to how we value Housing First and how the strategy will value Housing First, it is very, very clear that we are seeking to develop a housing-led system that provides stable, appropriate accommodation as quickly as possible. So all of that language that's there, you can read now through into the actions. Again, being very, very clear, and it's very clear in the strategy, Housing First will be a key delivery solution. So we see Housing First now as a key delivery model as we shift towards a rapid rehousing culture, and it will be a key solution for many chronic homeless customers, for customers who've experienced homelessness on a chronic basis, in the context of a number of those objectives in the strategy, where we're seeking to support customers exiting homelessness into settled accommodation. So that's probably as strong a set of words as you can see in a strategy, in a national strategy that puts Housing First at the centre of that. And when you put that alongside the focus on prevention, you can really see now, as I say, that things are in alignment. Alongside that then is the temporary accommodation strategy, and you can understand why this is so important to us, given what I've just said in terms of the growth in demand for temporary accommodation, both before COVID, but particularly since COVID and during the number of waves of COVID that we've had. Apologies, I've got background noise just outside the office here. But I think a key indicator of success within the temporary accommodation action plan is the need to minimise the need for temporary accommodation. And so again, what's the approach then? What are we trying to do? Well, year one in the action plan, we will continue to build Housing First services across Northern Ireland. We'll offer Housing Executive Housing First tenancies, and we are actively now, through the use of Housing Executive properties, applying changes to, or we certainly hope we'll be in a position to. We've got some work to do to make sure to undertake a quality impact assessment and so on. But where we can use our own allocation system to do that, we can. As I say, we've got some work to do to get there, but that's certainly, we hope that we will be able to do that, and that will provide stable tenancy, wraparound support to stabilise and provide services to the most complex clients. And again, we're very, very clear that has to be the priority, and doing that as quickly as possible in the first year of the strategy. So that gives you a sense of the strategic context. A couple of more minutes, Mairead, and then I'll stop. I'm sure you're keeping an eye on time. But just a few final comments in terms of where to from here. I'm not going to list all the things we're doing to enable Housing First, but believe you me, that's the question I'm asking my teams, and they're asking elsewhere, what are we doing to enable it? Because as everyone else has said today, it's not just about the model, but it's everything else that sits around that model. So our work on prevention, the work on temporary accommodation, actually the investment in social housing in this year is very high. It's up to 162 million. We are doing very well in this year in partnership with our housing association colleagues to keep levels of new social housing high and keep pushing as hard as we can, so that we don't, during COVID, and last year was an exceptional year in terms of exceeding the targets on social housing new build, which we did. And when I say we, I mean housing associations in partnership with the housing executive. So the all of the other building blocks that are required to make Housing First work, we are keeping our eye on all of those and pressing all of those levers to support the enhancement of the model. As you know, we're working with Depaul in terms of providing units of accommodation and support. From the Supporting People Fund, we've been able to provide additional funding during COVID, which has been really welcome, and again, welcome all of that additional funding from the department. As I said, we are actively looking at Rule 84, and apologies to those of you who aren't from here and don't know what Rule 84 is, but that's the rule in our allocation scheme that would enable us to allocate up to around about 50 housing executive tenants to the model, and again, moving as quickly as we can to work our way through how we do that. And that's going to be really, really important in terms of delivering the service, in terms of delivering this model, and then partnering with the right provider who will be selected at a point in the future to deliver the service element. And finally, a few comments from me. I mean, we are very, very, and I am pushing this on a personal level, very committed to ensuring that we need all of the departments around the table here. For Housing First to work, it requires investment across departments. It requires health, social care, justice to value the benefits and the outcomes associated with Housing First. And because it's called Housing First, naturally people say, oh, well, then it sits with the Housing Executive and the Department for Communities. And of course, it requires a greater response, a much more sophisticated response than that. And then I suppose finally, a few comments from me. I have to say, really, really like the feasibility studies that have been done elsewhere. I've mentioned the Liverpool study already, which I thought was really excellent. It's, you know, a feasibility study on a comprehensive rollout is something I personally support. It's certainly something we're actively considering in the Housing Executive. We're developing our future research programme. So that's about as positive a guarantee as I can give anybody today. But certainly I'm very interested in seeing the ways in which we can ensure that we use our research programme to explore ways to go forward. I'm also very interested, I have to say, in Maggie's presentation on the national framework that's developed, so we'll certainly want to follow up with that. I suppose final comment for me, I really strongly agree with the point that Maggie made in relation to when you're scaling up, it's about more than just numbers. It's actually about getting it right. It's about getting the partnerships right, the method, the delivery. I think we're in a strong, I would say this, wouldn't I? I think we're in a strong position here in Northern Ireland because we have a single housing authority. So actually, you know, you only have to knock on one door, and actually you don't have to knock on this door anymore because we are convinced and we do know the value of Housing First, and we are working in partnership with everybody, hopefully in this room, to put it into practice. And I think, you know, the next bit now, we've got the strategy, we've got the will to do it. I think now it's the systems change and the culture change. So look, things feel, I certainly feel very optimistic about where we are at, and I look forward to the next few months as we work our way forward. So thanks, Mairead. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thanks so much. Look, some really interesting stuff. I think the piece around that this is preventative as well is just so important to get that message across, because I think for the last couple of years, like, I think we've all been kind of not firefighting, but you know what I mean? Like, I think it's just a really important time to have that conversation. I know from Depaul's point of view, you know, Stella Maris being our service that we have Housing First out is a key example of kind of the real success there. And I think listening to Patricia again, it has just been like, I mean, couldn't find a better testimonial there from someone around the fact that it works. So look, I'm going to open it up to questions. We have our chat box open. Everyone seems a bit shy, but we'll get cracking. So if I can ask David, Maggie and Deirdre to put your cameras on as well, and we'll just, I'll go through some of the questions. We've 2 questions in so far. And also just to say, because we have everyone here in a room, if you have questions for each other that you might want to ask, do as well, because it's a good opportunity for people to have a chat. So a question from Katie is a question for Maggie. What would you like to see more of in your jurisdiction? I think your presentation was really impressive, but is there anything that you would want to see more of within your own jurisdiction that you think would add to the success?
One of the things we've really benefited from in Scotland is finding that the public sector, so local government as well as national government, on the topic of Housing First have been an open door. So for us, we haven't needed to spend time lobbying or advocating for Housing First to be the right way forward, because I know that's been the case in many other countries, and it hasn't for us, and that's helped a lot, having that kind of political commitment at a local and national level from the very beginning. What we still haven't achieved though, and I think most of our speakers have commented on this, is that multidisciplinary approach. So while we've got the absolute buy-in for those whose kind of portfolio includes housing and homelessness, when we're looking over to mental health or community justice or addictions, it's still operating a little bit in silo. Much of that is incumbent on us and the need to properly articulate the benefits and savings of Housing First across these other areas. But a lot of it is just in terms of how we can properly articulate the importance of this being a kind of multidisciplinary approach at every level. So how it's provided on the front line, the support, and how frontline workers can draw on support from different sectors and different disciplines, through to planning and obviously commissioning as well. So for us to scale up Housing First at the rate that we need to, will need more people putting money in the pot from across those different disciplines. So I think that's the key challenge and area for us.
Yeah, like I think Deirdre, your slide around the amount of groups that Depaul specifically are working on Housing First was just so impressive, and you were saying that wasn't even the full list, that if you'd left anyone out. So I mean, it's a really interesting point. David, sorry, were you going to come in there?
I think our experience has been in operating Housing First from quite a grassroots approach, is that we've managed to broker relationships on a kind of area by area basis and with individual professionals, but there still isn't the level of strategic intent from other organisations or even awareness at a really higher strategic level. And I think Grainia's champion of this from an interdepartmental point of view is hugely important in order for us. And I think there's an awful lot of work to be done at that higher level for higher strategic other authorities to recognise that they've got a key role.
Great. I'll go on. I'll actually pose this, Mary, to yourself, if that's okay. So from your experience, what do you consider the main components of success in Housing First and housing within, I suppose, your context?
I guess, I think I mean, for me, I suppose the scaling up in our context here, and when you think of like what it's now part of our national housing policy, there's a separate implementation for Housing First, but it's part of the national housing policy on the supply chain in terms of the planning. So it's local authorities are mandated to increase their supply of one-bedroom accommodation for Housing First. It's a cross-departmental plan, so Department of Health, Probation, prisons, they're all of those actions are contained in that. And I think a lot of that came from the very close collaboration. It had a very small beginning in Dublin, but it came from the collaboration that was on the ground in Dublin is what contributed, I think, to the collaboration at national level. And I do think it is important to take your time, get it right, build those relationships. I also think some of the buy-in, for example, the criminal justice buy-in in the Republic, that came, I think, from people actually tangibly seeing the success of people turning around their lives, or of how well Housing First, people who weren't returning to prison, who were managing probation services, were very, very keen to see more people going through that channel, and they were willing to put the money into it because they saw the success of it. And I think, I mean, there's no better thing than putting money into an evidence-based practice and work. So that's probably the biggest thing for me, that collaboration.
Great, thanks, Mary. So I have a question here for Grainia. So the question is, will the multi-year budget for 2022-2025 provide the funding necessary to expand the use of Housing First in Northern Ireland?
Mute myself. Well, the fact that it's a multi-year budget is great. So let's start with a positive. I think that provides certainty all round. I think at this point, Mark, and it's still a draft budget, and so I think this is where I think at the current, looking at it currently, I'm optimistic that it would enable an expansion. That's for sure. Whether it gives us an expansion at the rate that we would all want to go at, I think remains to be seen. So, you know, I think there's more work to be done to really understand just how far we can expand that. I think just on Mary's point, and look, I've said this before, both in relation to Housing First and many other examples. You know, if organisations like mine, and I'm really genuine about this, think that it's all about just building up your budget and then holding it really, really close to your chest, then we will never do things like Housing First. Housing First will work when we all share risk, and that means people like me putting some of my budget in the middle of the table and saying to health and criminal justice and probation, I'm going to take a risk, you have to do the same. And after this meeting, I'm just about to go to a meeting, again in the same room as a virtual meeting, unfortunately, on a very, very, very good piece of work which has been led by a number of organisations, including Belfast City Council ourselves, where we are, it's called Complex Lives Project, where we are all co-funding a piece of work which is place-based, looking at a small group of service users who need some additional help and support, and we are co-funding some interventions there. And again, it's not, you know, it's very close to, I mean, David is aware of it and others are aware of the project, and it's a really good project. So I think while the budgets, the individual budgets are incredibly important, what's more important is how we take our individual budgets and get the most out of them by sharing that risk and reward. And so that's what's more important for me, actually, on this one.
Although Grainia, I'd love, we're really advocating that you do get an uplift in your budgets in order to make it work, and you know, we're really supportive of that, because
please do keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, we absolutely acknowledge the pressure that supporting people fund is under, with all the competing needs and the increased pressures that you're under. And we're absolutely fully supportive of the housing executive trying to get more money around this.
Good. I'm delighted to hear that. Yeah, that's what we need.
So we have a very quiet group today. They don't have very many questions. Maybe we've covered everything, but here's a question just in. It's for Deirdre. Deirdre, will the tenancy deposit funding we had previously within Depaul be available in the future to help those accessing private rentals? Many thanks.
Well, we'd hope if the opportunity presents itself with funding being made available either through, you know, the Providers Investment Fund or other sources, it's obviously something that we would be keen to be part of and deliver upon. It absolutely enabled us to not only support individuals into new tenancies, but it also enabled us to support individuals who are at risk of losing a tenancy because they didn't have the affordability because of the level of poverty that they were experiencing. And so we were able, through our negotiations with the housing executive, to actually use that in a creative way to ensure that a person didn't lose their accommodation at that time. So the answer to the question is yes, if there is money available, it is something that we would seek to be part of the solution of providing a rent deposit to our service users.
Thanks. I did have one more question, but I think it's covered. I think we've covered it. I suppose, Maggie, it was for you really, and maybe for Mary as well. Like if there was one thing you would recommend to, I suppose, ourselves and in the context of Northern Ireland, what would that be, considering, you know, you've rolled it out, and I know we have in the north as well, but I think you've covered a lot of it. From guessing, I think it would be around the collaboration piece. Is that really the kind of key takeaway piece, that we all have to work together to get it kind of to the place that we would want it to be? Just unmute. Yeah, perfect.
There we go. It had to be one, didn't it? I think that's absolutely spot on. And Maria, I think it's absolutely about the collaboration that's needed to make this work. Also the persistence. I think what we are finding in terms of where we're at in our journey to scale up Housing First is past the big exciting bit, when there's a lot of colour and support and it's something new, innovative, we can demonstrate it works, and you get a lot of people interesting. It's kind of, you know, flavour of the month. And now that bit that we're reaching, which is, well, okay, people are bought into it, and it is now just that constant scaling up. So it's the long haul. and that's a different set of skills and a different set of kind of attitudes and understandings that we need to enable that to happen, because fundamentally what we're talking about, all of us, is a change management programme, isn't it? It's about an old way of doing things and how we convert that into an aspiration for a much better way of doing things, which centres people and the housing that they need to build and live a good life. And that's a rewarding set of outcomes that's promised, but it's always on the horizon, and it'll be a constant, I guess, a constant journey to reach that. So I think the importance of persistence, continuity, keeping going, and kind of working together to achieve that feels exactly where we're at, and hopefully that kind of resonates a bit, with your own experience as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. We have just a couple of comments here from Anya, who is our Depaul International colleague. So she just wanted to say, absolutely fantastic session. I joined from an international perspective and took a lot away from where Housing First is still in its infancy. So thanks very much. So thanks, Anya, and thanks for joining. And then Carla as well, thanks a million. So I suppose we don't have any more questions unless you have any questions while you're all here for each other. I don't know if you do, or I'm sure you'll probably be connecting with each other anyway in another context. So if there's no more questions, I'll wrap up this session. It brings it to a close, then a good close today. So thanks to everyone here who spoke, our guest speakers who joined us here today. It's such a pleasure to have everyone in the room together, start of a new year as well. So and thank you for your great insights as well into Housing First, and I hope it's leaving the people here with some great takeaways from the presentations. If anyone here wants to hear more about Depaul, they can get involved. They can visit us at depaulcharity.org. Thank you again for joining us, and have a really nice afternoon.
Thanks, Mairead.
Thanks for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mairead. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.